They laughed when the water hit me, but what they didn't realize was they were standing inside my company. The first thing I remember wasn't the liquid, it was the silence right after. Not complete silence. Just that half second where the room didn't know whether to laugh or look away. Then came the laughter. Soft at first, then louder, confident, comfortable, like they'd all been waiting for a moment like this. Olivia stood in front of me, glass still tilted in her hand, a faint smirk touching the corner of her lips, as if she'd just delivered the perfect punchline. The liquid dripped from my jacket, darkening the fabric inch by inch, sliding down the cuff of my sleeve and onto the marble floor of a ballroom that probably cost more per night than most people made in a year. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, throwing warm gold light across white linen tables, polished silverware, and faces that all seemed to blur into one expression: amusement. I didn't move, not right away, because moving too fast would have meant reacting. And reacting would have meant giving them exactly what they wanted. "Oh my God, Olivia," someone said, laughing under their breath. "You didn't have to do him like that." But she did. And the way she lowered the glass, slow and deliberate, told me it wasn't an accident. It was a statement. I could feel eyes on me from every direction. Her coworkers, her parents, people who had spent the last hour shaking her hand, congratulating her, praising her like she was the reason this entire company even existed. Not one of them stepped forward. Not one of them asked if I was okay. Because in their version of the story, I wasn't someone you checked on. I was someone you tolerated. "Seriously?" Olivia said, brushing an invisible speck off her dress, her voice light, almost playful. "At least try not to embarrass me tonight, Ethan." The laughter hit again, louder this time. Someone behind me muttered, "Guy's lucky he even got an invite." I let the words settle, let them stack. Every look, every whisper, every quiet assumption they thought I couldn't hear. 15 years ago, I used to correct people, used to explain, used to care about what they thought. That version of me didn't survive very long. I reached up slowly, adjusting my cuff like the stain didn't matter, like none of this mattered. Across the room, I caught a glimpse of one of the junior managers, nervous, stiff, his eyes locking with mine for half a second before he quickly looked away. He knew, or at least he suspected something wasn't adding up. Olivia didn't notice. She was already turning back to her circle, slipping seamlessly into conversation, laughter following her like it always did. To them, this was just another moment, another story they'd tell later over drinks. The husband, the embarrassment, the joke. I exhaled quietly, steady, controlled. No anger, no scene, just clarity. Because standing there, soaked under the glow of $1,000 chandelier, I realized something very simple. None of them knew who I was. Not my wife, not her family, not the man currently running my company like it belonged to him, and definitely not the room full of people laughing at a man they thought had nothing. I glanced at my watch. 9:14 p.m. Then I looked back at Olivia, just for a moment. Not with anger, not even with disappointment, just distance. 24 hours, I said quietly, almost to myself. Then I turned, leaving the laughter behind me, knowing that by this time tomorrow, none of them would be laughing at all. I stepped out into the night air and the door closed behind me with a soft, expensive click that sounded nothing like the weight it carried. Inside, the music continued, glasses clinked, and laughter filled the space I had just left behind as if nothing had happened, as if I had never been there at all. The valet looked at me for a moment, his eyes dropping briefly to the stain on my jacket before snapping back up, trained professionalism kicking in. "Sir, your car?" he asked, careful, neutral. I nodded once and handed him the ticket. The air outside was cooler than I expected, a sharp contrast to the warm, curated atmosphere inside the ballroom. It helped. It always helped. Distance has a way of stripping things down to what they really are. I stood there for a few seconds, watching the reflection of the hotel lights ripple across the polished black surface of the parked cars lined along the curb. For most people, a night like that would stay with them. The embarrassment, the humiliation, the need to go back in, to explain, to fix it. But I had learned a long time ago that some things are not meant to be fixed. Some things are meant to be ended. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. Then again, and again. I did not need to look to know who it was. Olivia always followed the same pattern. First came the performance. Then came the justification. Then, if necessary, the apology that never quite sounded like one. I let it buzz. When the car pulled up, I slid into the back seat and closed the door gently, the quiet interior wrapping around me like a barrier between two completely different worlds. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked. I gave him the address without hesitation. Not home. Not tonight. As the car pulled away from the curb, I leaned back and loosened my cuff, the fabric still damp against my skin. My reflection in the window looked exactly how they saw me. Tired. Unremarkable. Easy to dismiss. It was a useful illusion. One I had allowed to exist for years because it kept things simple. Because it kept people honest. And tonight it had given me everything I needed. Another buzz. This time, I reached into my pocket and pulled the phone out, not to answer, but to scroll past the missed calls and open a different contact entirely. The name sat there quietly on the screen, a name that never called unless something mattered. I pressed it. It rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, calm, alert. Ethan. No surprise, no confusion, just recognition. I assume this is not a social call. I glanced out the window as the city lights blurred past, each one a reminder of what had been built, what had been protected, and what was about to change. No, I said, my voice even steady, exactly the way it needed to be. It is not. There was a brief pause on the other end. Not hesitation. Calculation. What do you need? I did not rush the answer. Timing matters. It always has. I want a full internal audit initiated at opening tomorrow. Executive level and above. Financials, access logs, communications. Everything. Another pause, shorter this time. Understood. And freeze all discretionary accounts connected to the Carter family holdings until further notice. The city shifted outside the window, glass towers giving way to quieter streets, but my focus never moved. That will cause attention, he said carefully. That is the point, I replied. Silence again, but this time it carried something else. Anticipation. Anything else? He asked. I looked down at my sleeve, at the faint outline of where the stain had begun to dry, and for a moment I almost smiled. Not from amusement, from certainty. Yes, I said. Schedule a board meeting. First thing in the morning. I did not go home that night because home implies familiarity and familiarity requires trust, and somewhere between the laughter in that ballroom and the quiet of the car ride, I realized I was no longer interested in pretending either still existed. The driver pulled up in front of a building most people would walk past without a second glance. A private residence tucked between glass towers, understated, quiet, the kind of place that does not advertise what it holds inside. I stepped out, straightened my jacket despite the stain, and walked through the lobby where the night attendant gave a subtle nod. Not curiosity, not judgment, just recognition. That was the difference. Some places asked questions. Others already knew the answers. Upstairs, the apartment was exactly how I left it months ago. Untouched, controlled, every surface clean, every line intentional. I set my phone on the counter and poured a glass of water, watching the way the city lights filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, stretching across the hardwood like a map of everything I had built and everything I had chosen to stay away from. People assume power is loud, that it announces itself, demands attention, fills a room. The truth is, real power does not need to be seen. It waits. It listens. It lets people reveal themselves. And tonight they all had. My phone buzzed again, and this time I picked it up, not to answer Olivia, but to read the messages stacking one after another, each one shifting in tone. First irritation, then confusion, then something closer to concern. Where did you go? This is not funny. You made a scene. Call me back. I read them once, then locked the screen without responding. There was nothing left to say. Not tonight. Not ever in the way she expected. I walked into the bedroom, changed into a clean shirt, and returned to the window, the city still moving below like nothing had changed. But it had. It always does in moments like that. Not all at once. Not in a way people can see immediately. But underneath, structures begin to shift. Foundations get tested. And by morning, the cracks start to show. At exactly 6 a.m., my phone lit up again. But this time it was not Olivia. It was the confirmation I had been waiting for. Audit team assembled. Access secured. Preliminary review in progress. I read the message slowly, then set the phone down, letting the words settle. This was the part no one ever saw. The part that happened before the headlines, before the shock, before the realization hit the people who thought they were untouchable. I moved to the kitchen, brewed coffee, and stood there in the quiet, listening to the low hum of the city waking up. Somewhere across town, Olivia was probably just opening her eyes, still wrapped in the illusion of control, still believing last night had been nothing more than a moment she could talk her way out of. That was the thing about illusions. They feel strongest right before they collapse. By 7:30 a.m., the next message came in. Accounts flagged. Multiple irregularities identified. Executive access temporarily suspended pending review. I exhaled once, slow, steady, and took a sip of coffee, the bitterness settling in exactly where it needed to. This was no longer about embarrassment. It was not about pride. It was about alignment, about restoring the balance that had been quietly distorted over time by people who thought proximity to power made it theirs. I picked up my phone again and typed a single message, short, precise, impossible to misunderstand. 9 o'clock, boardroom, mandatory attendance. I sent it without hesitation, then set the phone down and looked out over the city one more time. The sun had just started to rise, cutting through the buildings in long, sharp lines of light, and for the first time since the night before, everything felt exactly where it was supposed to be. At exactly 8:47 a.m., the building felt different, even from the outside. The glass facade reflected the morning light the same way it always did, clean and impressive. But there was something underneath it now, something unsettled, like a machine running just slightly off rhythm. I stepped out of the car and adjusted my sleeve, the fabric crisp, unmarked, as if the night before had never happened. Inside, the lobby carried its usual quiet efficiency, but the energy had shifted. Conversations were shorter. Movements were quicker. People avoided eye contact just a little too deliberately. They felt it, even if they did not understand it yet. As I walked past the front desk, one of the receptionists looked up, her expression flickering between recognition and confusion before she quickly looked back down at her screen. To her, I was just a name she had seen once or twice on restricted lists, a presence that existed but never fully appeared. That was about to change. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent except for the faint hum of cables and the steady reflection staring back at me from the mirrored walls. Same face, same calm expression, no urgency, no hesitation. People think moments like this come with adrenaline, with racing thoughts and second guessing. They do not. Not when the decision has already been made. When the doors opened, the difference was immediate. Assistants stood closer to their desks. Phones rang longer before being answered. And behind the glass walls of conference rooms, small groups had already started forming, voices low, controlled, but carrying just enough tension to be noticed. Word travels fast in places like this. Faster than facts. Faster than truth. All it takes is one unexpected email, one locked account, one canceled authorization, and suddenly the illusion of control begins to fracture. I walked down the hallway without slowing, past faces that recognized me just enough to feel uncertain but not enough to understand why. At the end of the corridor, the boardroom doors stood closed, heavy wood, polished to a shine that reflected the overhead lights like a surface that had never been touched. Inside, I knew they were already gathering. Richard Hayes would be there, trying to maintain composure. Olivia's father would be there, likely confused, already making calls that were no longer being answered. And Olivia herself would be there, piecing together fragments, trying to turn them into something that still made sense. I paused for a moment outside the door, not out of hesitation, but precision. Timing matters. It always has. Through the glass panel, I could see movement. Papers shifting. Chairs being adjusted. A hand tapping impatiently against the table. The kind of subtle signs people show when they feel something slipping but cannot yet name it. My phone buzzed once more in my pocket. I did not need to check it to know what it was. Final confirmations. Systems locked. Access revoked. Everything in place. I reached for the handle, then stopped, just briefly, letting the silence stretch on the other side of the door for one more second. Inside that room, they still believed they were in control. They still believed this was a meeting they could manage, a situation they could explain away, a problem they could solve. That belief was about to disappear. I opened the door and stepped inside. Not quickly, not forcefully, just enough to shift the air in the room. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. And for a moment no one spoke. Not because they understood, but because something in the room told them they should not. I closed the door behind me and walked toward the table. Each step measured, controlled. The sound of my shoes against the floor echoing just enough to fill the silence they could no longer ignore. No one asked me to sit down, but I did anyway, pulling out the chair at the head of the table like it had always belonged to me. Like there had never been a question about where I was supposed to be. The sound of the chair legs against the polished floor was small, controlled, but in that room, it might as well have been a signal. Richard Hayes was the first to recover, clearing his throat, adjusting his tie, trying to rebuild the version of authority he had worn so comfortably for years. "Ethan," he said, forcing a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I think there has been some kind of misunderstanding this morning. We are in the middle of a very important meeting." I looked at him for a moment, not interrupting, not reacting, just letting him finish the performance he clearly needed to give. Around the table, I could feel the tension building, subtle shifts in posture, quick glances exchanged between executives who had woken up to emails they did not expect, restrictions they did not understand, systems that no longer responded the way they always had. Olivia sat halfway down the table, her posture stiff, her expression carefully controlled, but I could see it in her eyes. The confusion, the calculation. She was trying to connect the night before to this moment, trying to find a version of the story where she was still in control. "You did not respond to my calls," she said suddenly, her voice sharper than the room allowed. "What is going on?" I let the silence stretch for a second longer before answering, not looking at her immediately, letting the weight of the room settle first. "The meeting is not interrupted," I said calmly. "It is just beginning." That shifted something. Not understanding, not yet, but awareness. Richard's smile faded slightly. "I am not sure I follow," he said. "Then I will make it simple," I replied, folding my hands loosely on the table, my tone steady, almost conversational. "As of this morning, all executive-level discretionary accounts have been suspended pending internal review. Access privileges have been restricted across departments connected to the Carter family holdings. And a full audit is currently in progress." The reaction was immediate, though controlled. Papers moved. Someone inhaled sharply. Olivia's father leaned forward, his voice tight. "You cannot just do that. Those decisions require authorization." I turned my gaze to him, meeting it directly for the first time. "They already have it." Another pause. Longer this time. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then stopped, the certainty he had walked into the room with no longer holding the same weight. Olivia looked between us, her composure slipping just slightly. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice lower now, less performative, more real. I shifted my attention to her, not with anger, not with accusation, just clarity. "I am talking about alignment," I said. "About correcting structures that have been operating under assumptions rather than authority." Richard leaned forward, his tone tightening. "With all due respect, you are not in a position to make these kinds of decisions." That was the moment. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise. I reached into the folder I had set on the table when I walked in and slid a single document across the surface toward him, the paper stopping just within his reach. Take a closer look, I said quietly. The room went still as he picked it up, his eyes scanning the page once, then again, slower this time. The color in his face shifted, not completely, not enough for anyone to fully understand yet, but enough to signal that something fundamental had just changed. He did not speak immediately. He did not need to, because for the first time since I entered the room, no one was looking at me like I did not belong there anymore. Richard did not look up right away, and that was how I knew he understood exactly what he was holding. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the document, not enough to draw attention, but enough to break the rhythm he had maintained since I walked in. The room stayed quiet, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet. This one had weight. That is not possible, Olivia's father said, his voice lower now, less certain, as if the words themselves needed confirmation before leaving his mouth. Richard finally lifted his eyes, not toward him, not toward Olivia, but toward me, and for the first time since I had known him, there was no performance left in his expression, just calculation. It is accurate, he said slowly, placing the document back on the table with care, like it carried more than just ink and paper. The shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable. Chairs adjusted. Postures changed. People who had leaned back now leaned forward. People who had spoken freely now said nothing at all. Olivia's gaze moved from Richard to the document, then to me, her brows pulling together as the pieces began to rearrange in her mind. "What is he talking about?" she asked, but this time, the question was not directed at me. It was directed at the room, at anyone who could give her an answer that still made sense of the world she thought she understood. No one did. I did not rush to explain. I let the silence do its work, let the realization spread at its own pace, because truth does not need to be forced. It only needs to be revealed. 15 years ago, I said finally, my voice calm, even the same tone I had used from the moment I stepped into the room. This company was not what it is now. It was smaller, less stable, one bad quarter away from being absorbed or erased entirely. A few eyes shifted. Not all of them, but enough. People who had been there long enough to remember, or at least had heard the stories. At that time, I continued, decisions were made, structures were put in place. Ownership was redistributed in a way that allowed growth, without interference. I paused, not for effect, but for clarity, letting the words settle before moving forward. Publicly, the company evolved under visible leadership. Privately, control remained exactly where it needed to be. Richard did not interrupt. He did not need to. He already knew the rest. Olivia shook her head slightly, her voice tight. "You are saying you what? That you have some kind of stake?" I looked at her directly, holding her gaze without tension, without accusation. "Not a stake," I said. "Control." That word landed differently. It did not echo, but it did not need to. It settled into the room like something solid, something that could not be moved once it was placed. Olivia's father leaned back in his chair, the confidence that had defined his posture earlier now gone, replaced by something quieter, something more cautious. "If that were true," he said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "we would have known." I did not respond immediately. Instead, I reached for another document in the folder and slid it across the table, this time toward the center, where anyone could see it if they chose to. "You did not know," I said, "because you were never meant to." No one spoke after that. Not because they had nothing to say, but because for the first time, they understood that whatever they said next would not change the reality already in front of them. And in that silence, something else became clear. The room no longer belonged to them. It had not for a very long time. They had just never realized it until now. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like pressure adjusting in a sealed room, each person recalibrating their place without saying it out loud. Olivia was the first to move, her hand reaching toward the document at the center of the table, fingers hesitating just slightly before she pulled it closer. Her eyes moved across the page, faster than they should have, like she was trying to outrun what she was reading instead of understanding it. "This does not make sense," she said. But the words came out quieter than before, less like a challenge and more like a defense. I did not respond. I did not need to. The paper in front of her was doing that for me. Richard leaned back in his chair, his posture no longer forced into authority, but adjusted into something more practical, something that acknowledged the reality now sitting in the room. The holding structure, he said carefully, almost as if speaking it out loud might confirm it beyond denial, was never dissolved. I gave a small nod. It was never meant to be. A few of the executives exchanged glances, subtle, controlled, but loaded with implication. They were not just processing information. They were recalculating loyalties. That is what people do when power shifts. Not out of malice, but out of instinct. Olivia looked up from the document, her eyes locking onto mine, searching for something that was no longer there. Familiarity, control, maybe even reassurance. You let this happen, she said, her voice tightening again, trying to regain ground she could feel slipping. You sat there and let everyone believe. She stopped before finishing the sentence, but she did not need to. I understood it perfectly. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table, my tone unchanged. I let people show me who they were, I said. There is a difference. That landed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with enough clarity that no one in the room could pretend they did not understand it. Her father shifted in his seat, his voice lower now, measured. If what you are saying is true, then why now? It was a fair question, one of the few that actually mattered. I held his gaze for a moment before answering. Because until now, I said, there was no reason to intervene. The words settled into the room, heavier than anything that had come before them. Olivia let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. No reason, she repeated. So last night was what, exactly? I looked at her, not with anger, not even with disappointment anymore, just recognition. Last night, I said calmly, was clarity. That was when it finally hit her. Not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse, but in the subtle way her posture changed, the way her shoulders lost that last bit of certainty they had been holding on to. Around the table, no one spoke. No one interrupted, because they were no longer watching a disagreement. They were watching a correction. Richard cleared his throat quietly, his voice careful again, but now aligned. What are your next steps? He asked. I did not hesitate. The audit continues, I said. Every department, every account, full transparency. I paused briefly, letting that settle before continuing. And any position held under false assumptions of authority will be reviewed accordingly. No one argued. Not this time, because now they understood something they had missed before. This was not a negotiation. It never had been. I leaned back slightly in my chair, the room fully settled now, the tension no longer chaotic, but structured, contained, redirected. For the first time since I walked in, everything was aligned. Not because I forced it, but because the truth had nowhere left to hide. The room did not erupt into chaos the way people imagine moments like this should. There were no raised voices, no dramatic exits, no sudden confrontations. Instead, everything became quieter, more controlled, like a system recalibrating itself in real time. That is what real power shifts look like. They do not explode. They settle. Olivia sat back in her chair, the document still in her hand, but no longer being read. Her eyes were not on the page anymore. They were on me, searching, measuring, trying to find some version of the situation that she could still influence. You planned this, she said finally, her voice low, steady, but no longer confident. It was not an accusation. It was a realization. I shook my head once, slowly. No, I said. I prepared for it. That distinction mattered, even if she did not fully understand it yet. Around the table, the executives had stopped shifting. They had stopped reacting. Now they were observing, waiting, aligning themselves with what they could feel had already been decided. Richard straightened slightly, his role now clearer than it had been at any point before. The audit findings will need to be reviewed immediately, he said, his tone now measured, precise, no longer defensive. We should begin with financial oversight and executive authorizations. I nodded once. Already in progress. That answer landed with a quiet finality that left no room for interpretation. Olivia's father exhaled slowly, leaning forward again, but this time without the authority he had carried earlier. If there are discrepancies, he said carefully, they can be addressed internally. There is no need to escalate this beyond. He stopped, not because he ran out of words, but because he realized they no longer applied. I let the silence sit for a moment before responding. This is internal, I said calmly. That is why it is being handled here. The clarity in that statement closed the door on any argument he might have been trying to build. Olivia shifted in her seat, her composure tightening again, but now it felt different, less controlled, more reactive. You are doing this because of last night, she said, her voice sharper, trying to anchor the situation to something personal, something emotional, something she could still frame as overreaction. I met her gaze without hesitation. Last night did not create anything, I said. It revealed it. That was the difference she could not escape. This was not retaliation. It was exposure. And exposure does not require justification. It only requires truth. A notification sound broke the silence, not from my phone, but from one of the devices on the table. Then another. Then another. Subtle at first, but enough to draw attention. Emails, updates, confirmations. The system was moving. One of the executives glanced down at his screen, his expression tightening as he read. Another followed. Then another. No one spoke, but the shift was visible. The information was no longer abstract. It was real. It was active. It was happening. Richard looked at his own screen, then back at me, his expression now fully aligned with the reality of the situation. They have already begun implementing the restrictions across all divisions, he said quietly. I gave a small nod. Yes. Olivia looked around the table, her confusion deepening as she realized she was the last one to fully understand what was unfolding. What restrictions? She asked, but the question felt late, like it had missed its moment. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I reached for the final document in the folder and placed it in front of her, sliding it across the table with the same calm precision as before. Read it, I said. Her hand hesitated before touching the paper, but when she did, her eyes moved slower this time, more carefully, as if she already knew the outcome would not be in her favor. The room stayed silent as she read, every second stretching just enough to make the realization heavier when it finally settled. Because by the time she reached the end of the page, there was no version of this where she still had control. And for the first time, since I had known her, she did not have anything to say. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper as she reached the final line. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to see the exact moment it landed. The document did not raise its voice. It did not accuse. It simply outlined facts, clean and precise, the kind that do not need interpretation once you understand what you are looking at. Olivia did not look up right away. She read it again, slower this time, as if the second pass might change something the first one had not. It did not. Across the table, no one interrupted. No one offered clarification, because by now, they all understood that this was not something that required discussion. It required acceptance. This is temporary, she said finally, her voice controlled, but thinner than before, like it had lost something along the way. I did not respond immediately. I let the words exist for what they were. Not a statement, not even a question, just an attempt to hold on to something that was already gone. No, I said calmly. It is corrective. That difference settled into the space between us, quiet but immovable. Her father leaned forward again, slower this time, his hands clasping together on the table as if structure alone might restore some of the control he had lost. There has to be a process, he said, choosing his words carefully now. You cannot restructure leadership overnight based on. He stopped again, because even he could hear how uncertain the sentence had become. I met his gaze, steady, direct. "This is the process," I said. "It just did not start this morning." That was when the second layer began to unfold. Not through words, but through the devices still lighting up across the table. More notifications. More confirmations. One of the executives shifted, pulling his phone closer, his eyes scanning the screen before he looked up, his expression now fully changed. "My access has been restricted," he said quietly, not as a complaint, but as a realization. Another voice followed. "Same here." Then another. Each statement calm, controlled, but carrying the same underlying truth. The system was not reacting. It was executing. Olivia looked around the table, her eyes moving faster now, searching for someone who would challenge it, someone who would push back, someone who would tell her this was temporary, manageable, reversible. No one did, because by now, they all understood something she was only just beginning to see. This was not happening to them. It was happening around them, above them, beyond their ability to influence. "You cannot just remove people," she said, her voice rising slightly, not into anger, but into urgency. "You cannot just decide that everything changes overnight." I held her gaze unshaken. "I did not decide overnight," I said. "I decided a long time ago." That was the truth she could not argue with. Not because she agreed, but because she had no way to prove otherwise. Richard exhaled slowly, his posture now fully aligned with the reality of the room. "The audit has identified multiple authorization discrepancies tied to executive overrides," he said, his voice steady, professional. "Until those are resolved, access will remain restricted." He was no longer speaking as someone defending a position. He was speaking as someone implementing a directive. Olivia's shoulders dropped just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to signal the shift. The moment where resistance turns into recognition. She looked back down at the document, then up at me again, her voice quieter now. "So what happens next?" There was no accusation in it this time. No challenge. Just a question. A real one. I did not hesitate. "Now," I said, my tone unchanged, "we finish what should have been done a long time ago." The room stayed silent after that, but it was no longer the silence of confusion or tension. It was the silence of understanding. Because by now, every person at that table knew the same thing. This was not a situation they could talk their way out of. It was one they had already been written out of.